Hi, I'm Anna McKerrow, and this is my Magical People series. Today I'm here with Lucy. Hello.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Would you like to introduce yourself, Lucy?
I would. Yeah, so I'm Lucy Coates. I am a writer and I'm a mythographer, and I live in a barn in the middle of a field, right in the middle of the countryside, surrounded by nature, which is really, really important for me.
Oh God, and I've seen pictures, bits of your barn, like your views and or the nature, the birds you could come, oh sorry, I can't talk this morning, the birds that come by, it just looks absolutely idyllic. It's gorgeous.
It is. It's a really, really special spot, and it kind of feels sacred. It feels like land, and it feels as if I'm entrusted for now with its care, which is special.
That's so lovely. That's so lovely. Are you near? Well, no, I won't. Maybe I'll ask you that later. I was going to ask if you're near any kind of sacred sites, because sometimes it's ley lines and stone circles and all that sort of thing nearby, isn't it? Because I'm from the southwest and there's bloody tons of that everywhere. But anyway,
yeah,
maybe...
I can answer that now.
Yeah, answer it now.
I mean, not terribly near many stone circles, although I do have in my garden an enormous geode, crystal geode, an amethyst geode, which is about 4 foot high. And that does bring in the energy. And I keep meaning to douse the ley lines, because I'm certain that there are ley lines here. It feels like that. I mean, there are springs all over the place, and it just feels that there is definitely that energy.
Yeah. So, springs. That's interesting.
Yeah, we have all our own.
Do you? Wow.
Yeah, completely. So energy from the sun, water from the ground.
Yeah.
Clean air. I feel very lucky.
Oh God, I'm so jealous. Okay. So can you tell me about your magical practice, Lucy? So, I mean, in whatever way you want to, what does it look like daily, and what are the main beliefs and things?
Okay, well, I think to start, I probably should go back a way to the beginning, because although I had a fairly conventional upbringing, and of course I was brought up within Christianity, I never connected with that at all. But my uncle was a theosophist, and a mystic.
Wow, I did not know that.
Always, I always connected much more with his way of thinking. And actually, also, my dad always said, "Oh, I never go to church. My church is the fields and the woods, and that's where I feel closest to." Well, he used the word God, but for me, it's always been the goddess. So that is where that's where my practice begins, always with the goddess, and in particular with Hecate. And she, for me, is everything within my practice. So I say good morning to her every morning. I light my candles on my altar, and I feel her with me all the time. But that's not all my practice, because I follow the path of the Melissae, I suppose you could say the ancient Bee Priestesses of Crete, were also followed the serpent wisdom. So the three tenets of that particular path are bees, serpents, and in particular Python, the serpent Python.
Okay.
And Hecate is also involved with the snake. So my practice in the morning, kind of, I always do a practice called walking the 8, which is the lemniscate, which is the infinity symbol. And that's a kind of meditational walk between two rocks, with the knot at the middle. And so I'll take any questions I have, or just simply do it as a meditation, as a quiet meditation.
That's so so I've heard of that, but I haven't done it. So is it just that you are literally walking in a figure of 8 for a set amount of times round, or a set amount of time, or can you, how does?
Well, I mean, the least recommended time is 10 minutes. Walking the 8 has a particular effect on the brain, which and it calms it down, and it takes it into that other liminal space.
Okay.
So and I tend to find that, you know, if I start out, my mind's, even though I'm kind of trying to drop in and clear my mind, even if my mind's a bit scattered, by the time I've done 10 minutes walking the 8, I'm in that kind of state. And that's when any questions seem to be answered. I do hear my allies answering questions, my spirit guides answering questions.
That seems like such a lovely thing to do every day. Is it like many meditative practices, the more you do it, the more profound it becomes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yes, and also, I mean, you don't always just walk. I mean, sometimes I feel called to dance around the 8, or to crawl, or just simply to lie at the knot with my elm spread out, especially in the summer, when I'm doing it on grass.
Lovely.
Which is great.
Yeah. I had a psychic reading with a friend who I've interviewed, actually, Tiffany, one of these magical people interviews yesterday, and we are having a big conversation about the 8 infinity. So this has particular relevance for me today. There we go. We meant to have that conversation.
Well, yeah. In these ways, the 8 is seen as the path of 4 and a half, betwixt and between, left and right, above and below. And before you start, you always start with a thread of golden light coming from the sun star above, through your body, out through your yoni, to the earth star below. So you're all connected on that thread.
Yeah. And is there any ending part to it, or you literally just kind of stop walking when it feels right?
You come back to the knot, you give thanks, and then you collect your rocks and close your station, so to speak.
On with the day. Yeah.
On with the day.
Amazing. I love that. That's a lovely daily practice. Thank you for sharing that. Can you tell us a wee bit more about bee priestessing, if you're able? Because
yes.
That's probably a less well-known path. I think people would be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very much women's spirituality, and it's very connected to gynocentric practices. So I think the way we work mostly is through the womb. Unlike in traditional shamanism, where you would, let's say, journey to an outside place, we use the body as our journey place. But originally, the bee priestesses were allied to the. I assume you've seen the statues, the snake goddesses at Knossos.
Yeah.
Yes, the woman sort of standing with her arms out, snakes all around her arms, and a triangular skirt. Well, it sort of, I think it all started there, and then it moved to Eleusis, to the temples there, and so a lot of it is kind of based around the Eleusinian mysteries. And then when that all stopped, and you know, the patriarchy came in and destroyed everything, it then moved further north, and it was all underground, because nothing was written down, because it was too dangerous to write it down. And so all the practices were from mouth to ear, always passed down from mouth to ear. And it's the same way now.
Okay.
Nothing's written. And it ended up, well, certainly my teachers were taught by elders in Lithuania. So
Okay.
it then became a sort of European practice. And a lot of it is allied to the spindle and the spinning wheel and thread. So yes, so there's a lot of thread work, weaving, all those kinds, because that was how the stories were and the rituals were handed down in weaving songs.
Yeah.
And a lot of those were forbidden and suppressed. So that's where it all comes from.
Yeah. Wow. And weaving, obviously, you know, such a traditionally women's craft, which at the same time has such like a huge mythical resonance in so many different stories, doesn't it? Especially in Greek mythology, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you know, Greek mythology is my area of study. And very much, you know, the fates are the ones who are the Moirai. They're involved with the weaving. So the three fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. So one weaves the thread, spins the thread, one weaves the thread, and lastly, Atropos cuts the thread. And actually, Atropos I work with a lot, particularly in oracle work. When I do oracle work, I work with her.
Okay, so in the sense of cutting the thread, endings, I mean, I immediately start thinking about, you know, boundaries and cord cutting and all that kind of business, but it's like not quite that, or?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. You know, you can ask her, you certainly, well, I ask her, you know, if I need to finish something, I call her in to cut that particular threads. It's not just the threads of, you know, the threads of people's lives, and also, you know, with Clotho, the middle one, was it Lachesis? I sometimes have difficulty distinguishing, but anyway, the actual cloth of life, you know, obviously weaving patterns change and other threads come in, and it's a sort of circular thing in a way. It never stays the same, you know. Actions might bring another thread into the weave or whatever. So yeah, I love it. It's a living thing for me, weaving, although I don't weave myself. I do spin thread.
But you're a writer, so which is very much a creative practice of weaving words.
It is, yes. So I am a word weaver, not an actual.
How did you come to both Bee Priestessing and Hecate? I mean, was Hecate with you from a earlier time, it seems, perhaps?
I was always aware of Hecate, always. Actually, I think probably from the time, funnily enough, that I read The Sword and the Stone. She appears at one point, but also from the first time that I read Greek myths, which was, I suppose, when I was about 7. My granny gave me 2 books of Greek myths, and that was it for me.
Right.
I was just completely hooked, because I saw then that the stories could be told in different ways. There could be different weaves of each story from different perspectives, and that always fascinates me.
Yeah.
Then and now.
Yes, carry on, sorry.
Sometimes it's about unweaving the stories, and that's what I'm working on at the moment. Unweaving and weaving them.
There's quite a lot in, you know, as writers, we're both, you know, involved in the book world. There's quite a lot of feminist retellings of mythology coming out now. That's kind of in vogue, which is a nice thing. And which is very much that, isn't it? An unweaving and a reweaving.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is what I'm doing at the moment, because I hadn't realized until relatively recently that the Greek myths that we all know and love are actually rooted in the patriarchy.
Yeah.
And if you go back a long way, then the stories change. They're not written down, but you can see it in the art, and you can see it in various, archaeological digs and all that sort of thing. So I'm going right back, and I'm reframing the stories in from a matriarchal perspective.
Yeah. Yes, a hugely patriarchal system, really, Greek mythology, because the father god's at the top. Although it's nice that there are goddesses involved, obviously, and that there's that polytheistic element and all of those things. But yeah,
it is nice. But if you actually look at them, they're generally, the male gods do generally have the last say so.
Mm-hmm. And do a lot of horrible things to women also.
Do a lot of horrible things to women, exactly. And the thing that you have to look for in all those myths is where the serpent is killed. Because where the serpent is killed, that is patriarchy stamped on women's mysteries. So for instance, where you see the story of Python and Apollo killing the horrible black python snake with his arrows of light. Well, guess what? That's when he took over the temple at Delphi, which had previously been, sacred to the goddess, not to Apollo.
How interesting. So, thinking about other kind of snake mythology. So, what about? Sorry, this isn't Greek mythology, but you can probably talk about this. There's the bit in the Bible with the snakes going up Moses' staff. What's that all about then? Moses' staff? Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Aaron's staff.
Yes. I mean, that's probably the women's rights being taken over by the patriarchy. But the biggest one, of course, is the original story. Is Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Look at that story. The woman goes to the tree. The snake tells her to eat the apple because the snake is women's wisdom. And then, of course, everybody gets in a huge tizzy about that and says it's a disaster. And actually, it's not a disaster at all. Christianity, for me, is the most joyless religion. It's the only one which has that. Well, in fact, no, a lot of the religions of the book have that, but that story is exactly encapsulates that.
Yeah. Well, there's so much you can say about that, about the whole, Lilith being demonized and his first wife, and she wouldn't lay under him, and then she pursued a life of, having sex with men and bringing up their babies and having birth control, i.e. killing babies, and all those other things.
Yes, all those other things. But if you look, going back to Hecate, if you look at the beginning, and if you look at her through all the stories, her story arc is quite extraordinary because she doesn't start out as a goddess of the underworld. She starts as a goddess of the upper world, and she is equal to Zeus. She has agency over earth and air and water. She's not an underworld goddess. It's only later that she becomes associated with people like Medea, and goes down into the underworld with Kore, with Persephone, and then she becomes, she sort of becomes sidelined, and she becomes, and I use the word just in inverted commas, just a goddess of sorcery and witchcraft, and she's so much more than that.
Tell us, so talk to us about Hecate just briefly. So apart from a very popular goddess of witchcraft, as she kind of now is, and to me, I kind of rank her in the dark goddess area, perhaps probably not entirely rightly. But what else? What else can you tell us about Hecate?
Well, the thing is, Hecate, I think, is probably an incarnation of the.
So, Hecate.
Hecate, yes. Well, Hecate was, I think, the original incarnation of the creation goddess, in her original form. I mean, she is who I see as Mother Darkness. And this thing of darkness and shadow goddesses being somehow associated with evil and bad, and darkness is the original cauldron of creation. And I mean, I was given a phrase which I'm to use at all times, and it's this: through the gifts of Mother Darkness, we shall step through into light. So you can't have one without the other.
No.
So, you know, I embrace Hecate as a goddess of the dark, of the void. And I actually work with the shadow a lot. And that's something that's come more recently for me as I've entered cronehood. And I'm not afraid of it, you know, at all. I work. But Hecate originally was a goddess who was invoked before every single sacrifice. I mean, she had names like benign, obliging, you know, all those sorts of things. So she was, you know, she was a beneficent goddess. And then suddenly the story changed, and mostly it changed, as always, with the man. And it's always, you know, the written stuff we have is always from the men, with the man who is telling the story, and, you know, what his particular how shall we say, prejudices were.
Yeah.
It changed as women became more subservient and more stepped upon.
Yeah. And there's so much to say about, for me anyway, about ideas of light and dark, and how, as you say, we kind of, in this time now, in this place in society, we kind of grow up thinking dark, bad, light, good, which is kind of a very unhelpful duality about life, and that particularly that we have very, very unhealthy attitudes towards death, being it it's the only thing that will actually ever definitely happen to you in life, for one thing. And you know, that it's this inexplicable, this inevitable part of life. And yet we have this terrible, in the kind of I suppose post-Christian secular society here in the UK anyway, a real hangover about not talking about it, which is just so unhealthy. As one example. But then we have the a massive hangover as it comes to femininity and you know, as you say, darkness, which is not a good thing. It's a great thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's the labels which have been put on women as, you know, dark sorcerers. You know, always the other thing to look for, as well as the snakes, is always the dark, evil sorceress, the enchantress, the seductress, because that's another thing, of course, which is, you know, seen as dark and evil, is women's agency over their own sexuality.
Absolutely, and it's been so. And God, I'm having a terrible day for words today. It's been so regulated against, you know, women's bodies continue to be regulated in that way, but you know, much more so in the past, even, you know, before the pill, etc. And I was thinking also about so Kundalini as well, which is like the sexual snake energy of the body, which I get the impression has a kind of a similar resonance to the Bee Priestessing energy body. It's stuff.
It is funny when you find, you know, in various cultures all over the world, that snake image definitely always comes back to that. And actually, you know, in the matriarchal cultures, the snake, particularly the black snake, was a benevolent symbol of life and regeneration. And then it was deadly evil for the patriarchy, you know.
Of course, yeah.
But going back to what you were saying about death, you're so right about the fear of death. And I actually had my own very close encounter with death last October, near to Samhain, when my mum passed. And it was a privilege to act as her death doula, to wife her into death, by being with her, by singing to her, by talking to her, by holding her hand and just, you know, making that, giving her the companionship she needed in order to cross over the veil. And my daughter was there too, so it was a sort of, I very much felt the presence of the threefold goddess, the maiden, the mother, and the crow.
And it's, yeah, no, it's difficult to talk about. I know exactly what you mean. I've done the same for my own mother, and it is a tremendous honor to be there in those last moments, and to be able to be with the person you love, and you know, just love them, help them through, and from just as a human, you know, never mind a spiritual perspective, if you like, you know.
But so many of us are denied that because, you know, obviously, I mean, do not get me wrong, hospitals are amazing places and wonderful places. And, you know, they're healing places, but they are, by their nature, also places of death. And, you know, it's hard to have that experience in a hospital because you're surrounded by all the BP lights and all of that. And people keep trying to keep you alive. So there's this sort of idea that we have to be kept alive at all costs. We can't just have a dignified, gentle exit. You know, if I hadn't had a DNR certificate from my doctor, the nurse who came would have had to try and revive Mum. And use the paddles and all of that,
just
which is
traumatic,
really terrible.
Yes, and
Traumatic soul as well. I think.
In your, you may not be able to particularly talk about it, but when you've been with the kind of Bee Priestessing group, has the death doula kind of work come up as part of that? Is that something that people do in that tradition? Because I know it comes up in other paths.
I mean, it's not particularly. I mean, it was I was kind of called partly to do it. I mean, that was one of the times that Hecate came to me was to say that, you know, that would be part of my path to do that kind of work. And I know others who do it, but it's not a particular teaching.
No. It's a fascinating one to me. I mean, I've done a little bit of it actually through the Sacred Trust, who are a UK-based shamanic training organisation, who are very good, and I thoroughly recommend, who you know too. And not their bee thing, but I did a couple of things with them. One of them was, what was it, kind of basically death, dying and departure. So partly helping people move on, but partly moving on, kind of disincarnate spirit as well, in a shamanic kind of process, which is very profound and very it sounds like a weird thing to say, very lovely, you know, kind of very touching. I didn't necessarily even find it sad. It was just very hard to describe.
It's not sad, or it shouldn't be, because, you know, if somebody's lived a good life, you know, a good long life, and it shouldn't be sad. I mean, of course it's sad if you know, if somebody's life is cut off too soon, but I see it as part of the great circle, you know. I'm for that, you know, the great wheel, and everything. You step off when you're meant to step off.
Absolutely. I always feel like there's a lot of trauma in our kind of current culture, because we don't understand or talk about or have really the right rituals around death. I mean, depending on your own culture that you may do, but certainly as kind of secularists and predominantly atheist main culture in the UK, and I'm not talking about if you are lucky enough to belong to a religion that does have appropriate death rituals, good, you know, thank God, good for you, God. But I just feel that it also, because there's no understanding, creates a lot of trauma around death, but also around things that aren't death, but it's that are also about not constant expansion all the time. So there's this like constant outside of actual life and death, a goal, like a capitalist goal, you know, about constant expansion, constant light, constant growth, you know, and there's no honouring of, or little honouring of, the sort of fallow times, if you like, you know, that sometimes it's time to be quiet. Sometimes it's not time to constantly push all the time.
Well, this is true. It's so true, and this is why it's so necessary, I think, to go back to the wheel of the year, which is a living example of that. You know, in spring, you know, everything grows, and then in summer it comes to fruit, and we have harvest. Then everything dies, and we have the winter and the kind of the hibernation time, the quiet time. And then it all starts again. And living where I do, you know, I see that every single day. You know, now that, you know, the oak buds are starting to turn red, and you can almost feel when you put your hand against them, you can almost feel the life energy within them. And I mean, you know, for me, my own body follows that cycle, because I'm sort of a bit like a bear, really.
In what way?
I'm hibernator in winter.
Oh, right, yes.
I always get sleepier and kind of, you know, more inward, and that's when I do the sort of what I call the composting part of my book writing. You know, it goes within, and it sits within the cauldron, the compost heap, and it kind of, you know, all turns. Then it turns to good mulch, and then in the spring it starts to come up again.
Oh, how nice! That's such a nice way to think about it. What a lovely way to work. I don't work like that. I should think about that more, because there are definitely times where you feel, you know, writing is a slog, and then sometimes where it's an inspiration and things. I've never really stopped to think about the time of year that I'm doing it. Although I'm often very aware of the phase of the moon when I'm doing things, but only because I get quite affected at certain times in certain ways, which is kind of, at least it's nice to know. I was going to ask you, Lucy, also, what are your maxims for living life, if you have any?
Oh, my maxims for living life.
Give us some wisdom now.
Some wisdom now. Right. Well, I think the first one probably would be love the skin you're in. I think it's very difficult for us as women to do that, with all the things that we are bombarded with all the time, you know, in the press and magazines and on television, and, you know, the perfect body, or the one I really hate, the bloody beach ready body.
Yeah. Do you have a body? Is there a beach? Then you're ready.
Yeah, they're ready. Exactly. So that would be something. And you know, I do a particular self-love meditation. I've just begun doing that recently, where, you know, I go through my whole body and I thank it just as it is, exactly as it is, cellular, scars, you know, warts and all, exactly as it is. And actually that feels good. So that's the first one, along with never compare yourself to others, because that's a bloody waste of time.
Yeah.
And I think also you're never too old to learn new things. I think you should always be curious and willing to learn new things. Don't, you know, not closed off. I mean, you know, I'm learning all the time. I'm you know, I work with marvelous teachers, some of whom are much younger than me, and they have extraordinary things to teach me. And then I suppose also my 4 pillars. I like my 4 pillars. My 4 pillars are breath, darkness, earth, and womb. And when I put all those 4 together, I can get through most things. You know, I just, they're my centering things. They're what I use to, you know, calm me down if I'm in a state. I just take a moment and use them. And because I'm, or I have been, quite a hot-tempered person, I always try and turn, I can't remember which culture it comes from, but there's a saying that you should turn your words over in your mouth 7 times before you speak them.
Oh, wow, that's very good advice. Wow.
So I don't always succeed on that one, but I do try to do that one. And I think really the last one is just be kind. Be kind. You know, if you can, if you've got a choice between being kind and not being kind, be kind.
Yeah, always good. And they're kind of related, those 2 last ones, aren't they, a little bit as well? I have to say,
Yes.
I try always. It's always good to try, isn't it? You might not always succeed, but I always try, and as a naturally quite judgmental person, try and step back. I admit that about myself. It's fun. Step back. Is that kind? You know, come on. You don't.
Yeah.
For me, a good one to remember is you don't know what's going on in people's lives. You don't know that person. They're not you. Just, you know.
Yeah.
I try and
Absolutely.
do that.
And especially, you know, you look at places like, I don't know, Instagram or whatever, you know, and people do tend to put the rosy,
of course,
on for that, and you know, you don't know what people's pain might think they're having a marvelous life, but actually there's a great deal of pain. And so, you know, I know that when I've been you know, having mental health problems, because I suffer very badly from depression and anxiety, and you know, I know that I put things up on Instagram, cheery things up on Instagram, but I do try not to do that. I do try and be open about my mental health, but you know, walk a mile in somebody's shoes before you.
Yeah, my mum used to say that was a very good one. Definitely difficult, but a good one to try and do. Okay. I mean, actually, I was going to ask you, Lucy, sort of how does your normal life and your spiritual life intersperse? But you kind of talked about that quite a lot, about your writing, certainly, and how your spirituality go hand in hand. But is there anything more you'd like to say about that?
Well, there sort of is, because I mean, up until relatively recently, I have actually kept the threads of my life very much apart. So there, my family and friends thread, my writing thread, and my witchy, spiritual, kind of shamanic thread. And they were all in separate boxes, and they didn't really overlap. And I didn't talk about any of them to any of the others, really. But since I have been on the bee path, the path of pollen, which is what it's called, I had a knowing, a revelation, whatever you like to call it, that I had to bring all the threads of my life together. So, and that means openly doing something like this, which I would have found completely terrifying before, and openly saying, I am a witch. Because actually I found that very, very scary before.
Yeah, it is scary.
Yeah.
And for a lot of reasons.
Well, for a lot of reasons. I mean, the witch wound runs very, very deep in many of us, partly, I think, because many of us were witches in past lives and may have suffered for that. But also that collective witch wound of so many women, millions of women being killed for their wisdom, you know, because they were wise, because they were old, because they were herbalists, because they healed people. It's tremendously deep. So to actually say I am a witch is an act of bravery, even now, where, you know, in some places in the world that can still get you killed.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's always important to say that when we, as you know, white Western women, are talking about being a witch and what that entails, it can still come in a massive spectrum, you know, of magical activity, but it's very different again to what being a witch means in Africa, in terms of indigenous culture and elsewhere, actually, and they're very, very different traditions. and as you say, with a very different kind of repercussions sometimes.
But you know, it has so many, that word witch has so many things layered on it, you know, and the topmost of those, of course, is the, you know, the Wicked Witch of Halloween. Nowadays, you know, that's what people see when they hear the word witch. They see pointy hats and black cats and brooms, which is just not what it's about. It's a sort of corruption of, you know, there's a corruption of everything that it's all about. But when I think of the witch, I just always remember what it comes from, the root word of it, which is Wicca, which is wise. I mean, all witches are wise women of knowing.
Yeah.
You know, women who perhaps tap into things that we have long lost. You know, psychic stuff. I've been reading a really fascinating book about psychic women, and you know, how we can see auras and all sorts of things, and you know, it's been proved by the medical kind of community, but they don't really want to believe it. You know, it's
just
they don't. Energy, isn't it? That's what it is.
I know. Well, if you have a certain worldview, it's very inconvenient when other people say, "Oh, but what about this thing? Oh, that doesn't fit."
And again, here we are. It comes back to the patriarchy. I'm sorry to harp on about this. It's really cross.
Yeah. Another thing. So go back to the witching thing, which I think I knew, but we don't talk about as much, as well as, you know. I mean, men as well as women, yes, were killed for being witches and for practicing witchcraft, and men have also obviously in the past practiced witchcraft in a variety of different ways and still do. But also, interestingly, I think it's also probably the case that a lot of what we would now call neurodivergent, or indeed perhaps sort of people who identify as other in other ways, also came into that group for persecution, for being basically, I suppose, misunderstood at the time and marginalized, and it's, you know, that's the way of all persecutions, that they, you know, they always include the vulnerable and the misunderstood. And I was just reading about this the other day and thought that's a really interesting thing to remember.
Very much so. And actually it kind of makes me think of all the conversations that are going on now about gender, because actually one of the things that I am really interested in studying is the sacred androgyne, which, you know, a perfect mixture of the male and the female.
Oh, right, I see.
So, you know, and that very, very much is part of my studies. So yeah, and I think that, you know, that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing all, you know, the terrible othering of people, which is, you know, it's happened to the witch community, and it's now happening in other areas as well. Well, it always has been there, but it's, you know, it's cycles. Think different people get othered at different times of history.
It's yeah. I suppose, like most of us, it's very hard to understand why it happens, and I guess it probably happens for complicated and yet also very simple psychological reasons, but perhaps more complicated cultural reasons. I don't know what happens in history, and there's, you know, so much that goes into that. But we are talking about witches. And but that, yeah, sorry, carry on.
Witches were othered because of fear, and it's mostly fear.
Yeah,
all is mostly based around fear.
So I was reading a while ago about the Scottish witch trials in particular, as research for a book, and a lot of that, sort of in terms of what was happening in the culture at that time, was extreme poverty, which is quite similar to, you know, Germany in the 1930s. There was quite a lot of rural regions of Scotland. It was mostly, you know, rural then, and nobody had any money. And gosh, let me think. There'd been a change in terms of the system where you had a rich landowner. Oh God, now I'm going to embarrass myself because I can't remember the details. There'd been either the system where you kind of have the landowner and everybody lives and works on the land, and then that had changed, so that even though that was kind of an unfair system, there was the protection of the kind of the landowner, but then some people were pushed outside that, and got poorer and poorer, and then, you know, in a situation where there's very little to go around, then it becomes very easy to start persecuting people. So that it kind of came with that socioeconomic context as well. But there's a lot going on, obviously, in terms of that whole Hammer of the Witches, very formal decision to persecute people for witchcraft in a bizarre.
Well, I mean, yeah, completely. I mean, it was King James I was really the, you know, he was terribly interested in the hex and hammer and all of that stuff, and he, I think, thought that they were kind of blighting his reign, because I think that, you know, also you get that with the poverty. It especially shows up when you have extreme weather events. So, for instance, you have a terribly bad summer and the crops fail, and then you don't have any seed for next year. And so then it kind of it trickles down, and then the worst off in society get blamed, and it's usually the old woman with the cat, or the old man with the cat, or somebody who's been dabbling with herbs, you know, or whatever, because they have nothing else. They literally have nothing else other than nature's bounty to work with.
Yeah, but also have power, and people don't like that. And the whole, I mean, God, we could probably talk about the witch trial documentation and all that. I mean, it's so horrifying, actually, in terms of, even, you know, in Shakespeare, I can't remember, it's Macbeth with the pricking of my thumbs, you know, something wicked this way comes. So just a funny little rhyme. When I really found out what pricking was, I was so horrified. I don't know what I thought it was. Like, oh, someone's got like a needle, like a sewing needle, and stuck it into you. No, it's like a screwdriver. A fucking screwdriver, a big long one, goes all the way in, over and over again, into your body. It's just so horrific.
But also, of course, there were fake ones of those.
Oh, were there? What with the retractable end?
Retracted, so you'd push it in, and say, look, all the way in, she's a witch.
Yeah.
And of course,
I did not know that. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
No, there were all sorts of tricks that the bloody Witchfinder General had.
Oh wow, yeah. That's a whole other conversation, I'm sure. It's I mean,
imagine a society which has a bloody Witchfinder General.
It's so bizarre. Like, in what world does this happen? Yeah.
You know, women who showed nous or power or any kind of sort of thing that might single them out as anything other than subservient. You had to watch them, because what if other women decided to do that? What if all the women decided to do that?
Where would we be then? Yeah, I know. So, yeah, and just, I mean, we'll move away from the pricking, but like the literal kind of phallic penetrationness of it as well. I mean, it couldn't be any more of a symbol of patriarchal suppression, really, could you? I mean, unless you just painted a willy on the bottom of the tool, you know. But I'm literally going to keep penetrating you with this sharp implement until you submit. Thanks. Or die, which you will.
Yeah. And then I'm going to tie you to a faggot of wood and burn you.
Because that wasn't enough. For my fragile ego. I know. Anywho, but but just, you know, I suppose enough to say that there is so much trauma in that witch wound, as you say. And there's so much, and I remember I sometimes see a therapist who does something called body talk, which is a kind of a mix of biofeedback and kind of tapping. It's like witchcraft. I don't know how it works, but it's very good. Anyway, one time I saw her, and she said, "Oh, we've got just some standard witch trauma here. Need to get rid of that." And we kind of released it therapeutically. And from her point of view, interestingly, she said it's not necessarily even yours. It's just that, from her point of view, when you've reincarnated, you have picked it up from a kind of a central pool, if you like, of it, and you've brought some of it with you here now to help dispel it, to help release it. And we all probably do take up some, you know, past trauma, and we hopefully then expel it through, which I thought was a really interesting point of view. And I thought, I don't doubt it. I mean, obviously there are other historical traumas that are also still on our shoulders, goes without saying, you know.
Yeah, but I think that we do also carry past life stuff, traumas in our bodies, in the laboratory of our bodies, which, you know, can come to the surface, and it does come to the surface more and more when you start doing this work. The more you do this work, the more, you know, the thinner the veil becomes, so to speak. I mean, recently I had extreme pain in my shoulder, and I just had a past life thing come up, where I was pushed and drowned, but pushed in that particular place in my shoulder, and I had to work through that. And it was extraordinary work, but I know that that pain came from past life stuff. And yes, you say that to most people, and they say, well, they don't say anything. They just look at you and say,
yeah.
But, you know, the more I do this work, the more I realize that things that would be inexplicable to the secular world, so to speak, happen. And the more you trust your instinct, the more you believe your instinct, the more real it becomes, so to speak.
For sure. And in a way, if you're doing your healing work and it works, then, you know, great. You know, it doesn't, in a way, it does matter, but like, from as long as you are processing that healing through and you're getting rid of your pain, you know, and the pain is a message, isn't it? Saying, deal with this.
But it is interesting. You can't. Well, I've never found it very very useful doing actual healing, hot hand healing on myself. That doesn't work so well. I can do it on other people, but not on myself. I have to do it a different way for myself.
I think it's quite interesting how people come, as somebody who's sort of like, I've always come from that sort of healing background. I've done that, you know, particularly Reiki, and other things as well. It's interesting how people gel with different techniques, and it's what you know, obviously things must work for different people in different ways. Reiki's always been great for me, not so much for other people, but although, you know, it works regardless of whether you believe it or not, but which I like. People always say, oh, but what if I don't believe it? I'm like, don't give a shit, literally just sit down. It doesn't matter, it'll work. Like, but what am I going? I'm gone off on the tangent there. Yes, anyway, but I think, I mean, personally, I think there's so many people who have, you know, they'll have things sitting in their system, which is past life stuff, current life stuff, other, they don't do anything about it because they're not aware of how to do it or how that works in any way, which is, you know, kind of sad. But on the other hand, I suppose I think you'll come to it in your own way if you're
when you
meant
when
to.
you if you want to and if you're ready.
Yeah.
I mean, but I do think that once you take the decision to step onto this path, whichever path you're on, but this, you know, it's like peeling an onion, you know, the layers just keep on coming off, keep on coming off, keep on coming off. And you never quite, you know, well, I certainly haven't got to the center of the onion yet, but, you know, I think I'm in definitely in the sort of the tender white parts of it.
Yeah. They say, I mean, healing certainly is cyclical, or like, because of spiral perhaps. You're never done, and you'll often come back to the same thing but in a different way, you know, to heal it on a different level. You know, you've started off maybe physical, emotional, you'll come back being spiritually, then something else, you know. It's a journey in that way. It's quite an interesting journey.
And if you don't deal with it, I mean, I have found this myself, if you don't deal with something, then spirit will plonk it in your path in a different way, more and more kind of radically, until you actually do deal with it.
I know. Oh God, all right. Yeah. Yeah. You have to just let it happen. I was on one of these interviews, I was talking to somebody, and he's very, very different perspective, and he said, paraphrasing, magic happens when you can get yourself out of the way and let it happen, basically. And I thought that's so true. Very true.
Magic is not ever ego driven, and that's the whole, well, for me, the point of this work is to just get out the ego out of the way, and to be a channel with humility.
That's a nice way of putting it.
I don't mean the sort of Uriah Heep fake humility. I meant you really have to, as your other interviewee said, you have to get out of your own way, remove the ego, and just be, you know, centered. I think that's really important.
That's a good sort of general endpoint. Thank you. My last thing I was going to ask you, Lucy, was is there a book or a resource or anything that you would like to recommend to people watching? Something that you love?
Oh, so many things.
So many things. Just like keep sharing them. This.
Well, yes. Two books. I would highly recommend Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. That's the most beautiful book, which combines, I suppose, science and nature and stories. That's a beautiful one. I've also been reading a book called Cassandra Speaks by Elizabeth Lesser. A really interesting take on what happens when women speak with power. Then I also love a book called Our Lady of the Dark Country by Sylvia Lindsay. It's wonderful. That's another reframing of women's myths. I mean, I suppose I should say that, you know, if you want to know more about the Path of Pollen, or the Lyceum as it's known, the sacredtrust.org is the place to go. And then I suppose two of the tools that I love, you know, the sort of outside tools, so to speak. There's two lots of oracle / tarot cards, and I do know people love to work with those. But one is the Wildwood Tarot by John Matthews and Mark Ryan, which is very much shamanically sort of nature-based, Celtic law-based. I do love that one. I told you I pulled the Green Goddess card, Green Woman, last night for this interview. So I felt at my back today. Other one, which I've only just discovered, is called the Weaver's Oracle by Karen Hillier, and that is the most extraordinary oracle I have ever come across in my life. It completely fits in with the work I'm doing at the moment. So seek that out. And I mean, you just have to go and read Carolyn's story about how she made this oracle. It took her years and years and years. She did these extraordinary paintings for the cards, and in every painting she made all the things within the paintings. She actually went and made them. So, you know, skirts, clothing, everything.
Wow. In fact, I'm now remembering I saw an exhibition of some of the paintings in Glastonbury some years ago, where she'd set, I think, I can't remember how many there were, maybe 15 to 20 of them in the room. You could kind of just walk around and sit with them. They were incredibly powerful. I actually bawled my eyes out in front of one of them. Yeah, it was beautiful.
Yeah, so highly recommended that. Recommended. I think you get it. Seventh Wave is the place to get it.
The Seventh Wave, yeah. I know Carolyn Hillier is lots of people are big fans of hers. I think for good reason. Yeah. Thank you, Lucy, so much. This has been a fantastic interview. I've loved it.
Well, I've loved talking to you. Thank you very much for having me.
You're so welcome. And I'm going to say have a great day to everybody watching. And bye for now. Bye for now to Lucy.
Bye.
Bye.